Thank you, everybody. Could everybody hear me in the cheap seats in the back? I'd like to forgo a mic if I can. We're good? Okay, great. So, hello. My name is Cameron Garrity, as Kelly said, and this we have here is my pal Scrap, who I promise will be talking later on today. And we're here to talk about reality. And as I was thinking about my own reality and what's brought me here today, because my reality is only applicable to me, I thought, well, what got me here? And I thought that I should title my talk how Big Bird and Belle made me a real adult. Framing this, of course, in the realm of puppetry. I consider myself a creative person. I think everybody in the room, CreativeMornings, that's great. I work as a graphic designer, and I also do work when my 9-to-5 job is over as a storyboard artist, as a writer and a sketch comedy person. I do acting. I make spreadsheets and like color coding. And then I also direct. And all of these art forms come together to inform my life and my work as a puppeteer. And as I thought about my role as a puppeteer that brought me here today, some people may have seen me speak at TEDx Buffalo. I also do commercials and short films with a company I created with Adam Krutinger, Future Self Productions. And then I also created the Geppetto Festival, which is a nice biannual event, or every other year, that we do at Damon College. So as all this puppetry is coming together, and thinking about reality, in my TED Talk, Scrap and I talked about how puppets make the most successful fictional characters in all of history. And as Kevin and Keith know, who work with me at TEDx Buffalo, they've heard this a lot. And the reason I say that, if only because Scrap is actually here. If Scrap was an animated character, he'd be a little tennis ball on a stick. He's here and he shares our space. And that's why I maintain that puppets are real, and why I think I'm here to talk about reality. I have this feeling, I'm not sure about a lot of things, but I'm really sure that there are no accidents in life, and you could assign this to any kind of creator or way of thinking, whether it be God or multiple gods, just fate, astrology, the holy fawns, the universe, or if you're a Harry Potter fan, maybe we're just all in a really great J.K. Rowling novel. But whatever one of these faith beliefs you believe in, everyone's here for a purpose. Everyone is here as a miracle, if only because the genetics numbers game of how your mom and your dad made you and or possibly your siblings, that's a miracle. And we're all here for a reason. And I think you're damned lucky if you figure out why you're here on this earth. And I think I'm one of the lucky people who has found his calling. If only because since the day I was born, there are no words. So I thought we could go back to my beginning when my reality started and work up to today. So I started, at the risk of dating myself, on December 26th, 1990. And this was at the end of arguably one of the hardest years for American puppetry. Back in May, we had lost Jim Henson at the early age of 53, and the world didn't know if they'd ever hear Kermit talk again, or Ernie, or Rolf, or the Swedish Chef. And this was really devastating, and the puppetry community didn't quite know how to go on. Fortunately for me, as a kid, reruns existed, and merchandise existed, and when the shows ended, my house did and still looks like a Sesame Street catalog. There were books and toys and CDs and cassette tapes and VHS tapes that allowed that world to live with me even when it ended at 10 in the morning. My first words after Dada, which was dad, was DOWRD, which meant Big Bird, which my mom loves that happened before Mama, but And also, as I was growing up, if anyone is part of the Nickelodeon generation, it was wonderful. You used to get to watch The Muppet Show, followed by an episode of The Muppet Babies, followed by another episode of The Muppet Show, and then you switch the channel to PBS to watch an hour of Sesame Street. So that was 2.5 hours of Muppet programming every day. I was blessed. It was great. It was high times. And this all led up to December 25th, 1994, the day before I turned 4 years old. And this is where my path deviated with a lot of the other Muppet fans who were living at that time. Because that night, Santa brought me another VHS tape that was vaguely called The World of Jim Henson. And it had this photo on the cover, and I imagine Santa or my parents thought that it was just another compilation of the works of Jim Henson. It wasn't. It was something so much better. It was a PBS Great Performances documentary about the whole life of Jim Henson from the time that he was 16 years old, starting in Leland, Mississippi. And it had people like Frank Oz and Maurice Sendak and Francis Ford Coppola talking about Jim Henson's enduring legacy on this cinematic landscape. And I didn't know what any of that meant. And I didn't even know who most of the men were who were talking about who Jim Henson was. But something was unmistakable, because I watched my favorite iconic moments from Sesame Street and The Muppet Show, and they pulled back the cameras. And you got to see these very talented men talk about how Kermit was a marionette when he wanted to ride a bicycle. Or there was a man inside Big Bird who had a tiny little television screen on his chest so he could see outside of the bird. Or how Miss Piggy was played by a man, and that was very confusing for me at the time, but we got through it. But I absorbed this stuff. I ate it. I loved it. And as religiously as I had been watching those 2.5 hours of Muppet programming a day, I added this to the repertoire, and I learned and I absorbed, and I tried to figure out how all of this stuff worked. I would put on my toy Kermit puppet, and I'd pop in the Muppet movie, and I'd try to make sure that I could get Kermit to be manipulated just the way I saw Jim Henson do when I watched him perform on The Muppet Show. And I decided that puppetry might be a cool thing to choose as a calling. And I would perform plays in my living room, and every puppet show could become Beauty and the Beast in like 3 seconds flat. And you would sing the songs that were beautifully written by Alan Menken and Howard Ashman, and I belted out the lyrics. I want adventure in the great wide somewhere. And somehow Belle and Big Bird and Jim Henson and all of these creative influences were all calling to me that this was something bigger. This was something that I had to be. So now we're going to jump a little bit ahead of time to April 2001. I was in 4th grade. I was 10 years old, and another documentary came up on the air. This one was an A&E biography special on Sesame Street. And it was a little different than the Jim Henson one that I had been seeing for 10 years up to this point, because it interviewed people like Carol Spinney, the man inside Big Bird, and Steve Whitmire, the man who took over for Kermit and Ernie after Jim Henson passed away, and Kevin Clash, who originated Elmo. And all of these guys talked about how puppetry was a job. It was something that you could actually get paid for to do, which somehow that connection wasn't made in the Jim Henson one. And the other crazy thing was that they were all 10 years old when they started puppeteering. It was another weird coincidence. And another coincidence was that the guy inside Big Bird, his birthday was December 26th, just like mine. Granted, it was in 1933, but it was still a really big deal. Again, it felt like the universe was saying, hey Cam, puppetry, and they'll pay you money to do it. It was incredible, I had to do it. So since the spring of 2001, I had my Kermit puppet, and he would help me out through oral presentations and different school projects, and I began to build my own puppets. And I went into high school, I designed and started to make shows where I integrated video, and I learned how to puppeteer for a television monitor. And that took me into college, which is where I started at Damon in the fall of 2009. So at this point, I'm at the Amherst campus, and I'm in a theater course with an eccentric Brit who wrote about Shakespeare on his chalkboard, and this is his handwriting. And if you could imagine, it was a little difficult to understand what this eccentric Brit would sometimes try to say. And so I went to his office hours one day, and it was the spring of my freshman year, and I said, I'm just not getting it. And we talked for a little bit, and he was looking at my notes, and I realized maybe 10 minutes into that conversation, he was really distracted by something, and that something was my handwriting, which looks like that. And midway through that conversation, he took my notebook away from me, and he says, "You have the most beautiful handwriting I've ever seen. Would you like to be my stage manager?" And I didn't know what that meant. You shouldn't know what that means. But what he was looking for was someone to help him out in a show called Mr. Obufo. And he needed someone who was organized, who could sort of figure things out and keep a book. So he didn't have to be organized, which he had no capability of doing. And so I said yes, because I kind of had this improvisation mentality of you just say yes to things. And at our first meeting right after that, he said, okay, and then we need to find on this campus, it's going to be a tough thing, but we need to find a puppeteer. Because we're going to have a puppet in the show, and we need him to, or her to perform. And that's when, again, the improviser in me said yes, and for the first time I performed a puppet that was not in the vein of Jim Henson or the Muppets. This was a beautiful piece created by Michelle Costa, who's another Buffalo puppeteer. So I did this show, and I just fell in love with now a larger world of puppetry. I knew that, yes, there was Jim Henson, and he was great, and he was influential, and he's the quintessential American style, but there's so much more to explore, and I needed to figure out what that was. So I found some grant money through Damon. It allowed me to go to different festivals, and I got to see Warhorse, which was like life-changing for me. The story wasn't great, but the puppets were amazing. And through an intricate series of Facebook stalking, I found my way to Sesame Street, thanks to an incredibly gracious Muppeteer named Pam Arciero. Pam, incidentally, runs the National Puppetry Conference at the Eugene O'Neill Theater Center, which is where young puppeteers get to study from the grand masters, people who worked with Jim and other incredible forces in puppetry. If you know Walter the puppet, who was in the newer Muppet movies, he was at the first, that puppeteer, Peter Linz, was at the first one of these conferences. And so I've been studying there for the last 5 years, every June in Connecticut. And that's where I started to make my own puppets that weren't Muppets and find my own voice and point of view as a puppeteer. And at this point, you get to see me demonstrate a little bit with Scrap. And some of the things that you learn as a puppeteer, it's not just about a silly voice. That's great if you can do it, but as you can see, it's a little complicated. And now that I am on camera, and he goes away. He's just going to talk for me. And so as you can see, his right hand is down there, and it's going into my mouth. And that's how I'm able to talk. And his right arm kind of can bob me up and down. I could come up here. I could go over there. I could spin around if I wanted to. And so that's happening with his right hand and his feet. And then his left hand, like an intricate pair of chopsticks, can move my hands around. And so Cameron can perform me for some things. I could give people hugs if I wanted to. I could wave really nicely. That Cam could do by himself. If I wanted to pat my head and rub my tummy, I would need a second puppeteer, but that's for some other time. But anyway, so as you can see, Cam is breathing life into me. And even if I'm going to stand here just for a second. And you can see, I'm going to whisper. You can see that even in my stillness, I still have focus. I'm still breathing. I'm still alive. And that's something that I couldn't do if I was just on that cold pole over there. And so I'm going to stop talking, and I'm going to have, yeah. So that's a little bit. And at this point, I'd have Scrap not look at people, because if he was just dead, you would all hate me if he was looking at you at this point. Um, so one of the things that I learned from all the studying that I did, one of the people who created the Warhorse puppets, Adrian Kohler, says that a human struggles to die on stage, but a puppet struggles to live. If I was to act out some great piece of Shakespeare, I'd really have to struggle to hold my breath and for the light to go away from my eyes. But for Scrap, it takes everything in me and in him to give him that breath and to put that light in his eyes. It's not the same. It's not the same if he's just there like, That's a miracle. It's something that the audience doesn't get to appreciate. It's something that as a puppeteer, we don't get time to appreciate it because we're so busy, straining our arms and looking at our monitors and writing our scripts. But for this to happen is really an incredible thing. We learn so much from puppets. We learn from them how to laugh. From our earliest days, we learn how to sing from these guys. We learn how to dance. I hate that these guys are part of our family, but Barney's a part of the puppet family. We learn how to tell jokes. We learn how to criticize people for their really bad jokes. We learn later on how to deliver really cutting insults. We learn how to be a good neighbor. We learn how to balance our diets and how to balance other people's diets. We learn friendship from these guys. We learn what it means to cope with death and how to live in spite of that death. Jim Henson said in a letter to his family and colleagues before he passed away, "I don't know where ideas come from. It's just a matter of figuring out how to receive ideas that are waiting to be heard." We have opportunities that come to us every day, whether it's a Jim Henson documentary on the day before you turn 4, or an eccentric British person who's obsessed with your handwriting. And it's a matter of being willing to be open to these ideas. And from the time you first hear a yellow canary sing, or a young French housefrau fall in love with the beast, these are all really important, miraculous moments. And I could kind of draw a line from my earliest days through schooling, through after schooling, that bring me to right here, right now, this moment with you, and I look at this world of puppetry and how it's informed the scripts that I write and the storyboards that I draw and the spreadsheets that I color code. And this puppeteer's mentality of doing all these things and being open to ideas can be your mentality too, because again, we're all creative people. And it's about finding what your version of puppetry is. Find that rainbow connection, if I dare borrow a phrase that strings you along from one moment to the next. Again, open to whatever faith that you follow, and you realize that your reality is happening, and you have to struggle to bring it to life. So that's what Scrap and I have to say about all of that. Thank you.